Hello, everyone. My name is Brennison Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates. Where I'm calling in from is St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's very rainy today. So I'm feeling a little gloomy, but also kind of mellowed out, which is nice. Yeah, so Maggie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Royer, she, her, hers, and I'm the Youth and Prevention Program Manager at Violence-Free Minnesota. I'm also calling in from St. Paul, and I'm also feeling a bit gloomy from the weather. Also, I apologize. There's a train going by right outside my window, so if you hear background noise throughout the webinar, that's what it is.
Great. So hopefully everyone can see Aaron, the interpreter, as well. Please send in the chat if you cannot. And you also have the option to turn on the subtitles for the transcript as well too, if that is helpful for you. And before we officially get started, I do want to name, I have seen some in the chat of acknowledging a lot of the impacts of racism and other forms of oppression, misogyny, and how that has impacted so many communities in general, but especially marginalized communities, especially the Asian American, Pacific Islander communities. And so I just wanted to name that and acknowledge that and say that, for me personally, it's been really difficult as well too. So I wanted to let you know that you're not alone in that. And in general, when we have these conversations regarding domestic violence and related topics, we always have a disclaimer that, there might be some things that can impact you all differently depending on your experiences. Even if you weren't anticipating it, it's not unusual for our webinar attendees to later realize during the webinar that it's something that hit home to them or something that they needed to attend to their own personal needs, or it could be something outside of the webinar that happens during the webinar too. If you do need support or someone to talk to, maybe if you are realizing you have had a lot of experiences that are in line with reproductive coercion and you didn't know it, or any kind of abuse that we might mention, we do have Mary Beth listed as a panelist here, and she's also on the screen. And you can reach out directly via chat or to all of the panelists, and she'll be able to support you if you do have any. And she just sent a message in the chat too, so you can feel free to reach out. I am seeing a message that they're unable to see the interpreter. I don't. I would say maybe change your view. So if you are on a laptop, you should be able to change it to gallery view, but both of the interpreters are pinned. Thank you so much for your patience with that. So pass it on to Maggie for a little bit of some disclaimers and objectives for the next 90 minutes together.
Thanks, Brennison. So before we get started, we just wanted to issue a disclaimer that this presentation is not going to cover policies and legislation around reproductive coercion or lack thereof. It's also not going to be a presentation that discusses perspectives around criminalizing reproductive coercion. That's not our areas of expertise, and that's not the focus of today's presentation. Today's presentation is focused more on what reproductive autonomy might look like in romantic relationships, some warning signs for when autonomy in a relationship might be compromised. We'll also talk more about the different forms of reproductive coercion. There are quite a few, and we'll share some information about resources. If you or someone you know maybe is experiencing reproductive coercion, or there's someone in your life that you care about, that you're concerned about. We'll also talk a little bit more about boundaries, specific to hopefully preventing reproductive coercion and reclaiming reproductive autonomy in the same or new relationships. So that's kind of just a roadmap for our next 90 minutes together today.
So a little bit about our respective organizations. So if you're new to these webinars, welcome again. And we at Women's Advocates, we host about 4 webinars every month with various themes and topics. And so we are really lucky to be able to partner with Violence Free Minnesota and Maggie. But a little bit about our organization. Our mission is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. And so we are one of the first domestic violence shelters in the United States, located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we have kind of 3 different parts of our organization. One is this, so education and outreach and prevention. And then we also have an emergency shelter, a 24-hour crisis resource line that Mary Beth is often on, and our housing and aftercare program as well. And so our website is linked on the screen. So when you're able to get the PDF, you'll be able to click on that and learn all about our organization if you're curious. And you're always welcome to reach out if you have any further questions.
And just a little bit of background about Violence Free Minnesota. We are the statewide domestic violence coalition in Minnesota. We've been around since 1978. We have about 90 plus member agencies across our state, and most of them provide direct services to victim survivors of relationship abuse. So our goal as a coalition is to support victim survivors, educate and connect all of our member agencies, challenge systems and institutions to better respond to survivors, promote social change, and end relationship abuse for all.
So a little bit more on what domestic violence is broadly. So we often conceptualize it as this pattern, this intentional and systematic pattern of behavior that a person can use to gain power and control over another person. It's typically within the context of a current or former romantic relationship, so spouse, dating, maybe it's a sexual relationship, maybe it's romantic in nature. It can also be any other within the context of a family relationship, so aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, children to parents, and also in the context of household, which has definitely been something that is prevalent and important to keep in mind, especially with the pandemic. And in these different circles, you'll see the different ways that the different kind of behaviors that people who choose to use abuse, their tactics that they use to gain that power and control over another person. So there's a lot of different ones. Last week we talked about social abuse and a lot of things that are on the screen in terms of monitoring, isolation. It also regularly intersects with emotional abuse as well too. So there's a lot of different forms to keep in mind. And here are some other forms in these boxes. And for some people it can be really, overwhelming to see that, wow, there are truly so many different tactics, so many different behaviors and forms that abuse can take, and that it is really tailored for the specific victim survivor, what the abusive person will think will be most effective in kind of getting what they want. And one of those tools is reproductive coercion, which we'll talk about more in depth. But if you are curious about any of these other forms on the screen, you can definitely, again, click on them once you have the PDF. And we also have a lot of webinars that specifically speak to each of these. Not all of them yet, but hopefully soon. So we do want to begin with creating a word cloud. So what we'll do for that, if you do have a camera phone, you can take that out and open the camera and point it at this QR code, and it will open a link to add some words regarding what you think of when you hear the term reproductive coercion. So I'm going to also send a link in the chat as well too. So here's the link. And so there's a lot of different ways to get to it, but hopefully one of them works for you, and you can add up to 10 words, and then I'll start to pull that up so we can kind of start to create this word cloud together. All right, so a little bit more on who experiences reproductive coercion.
So we want to make clear that reproductive coercion is not an issue that only impacts cisgender women. A lot of the current research, most of it in fact, on reproductive coercion does focus on cisgender women as the primary population who experiences reproductive coercion, but we know that individuals of all gender identities can and do experience reproductive coercion. And we're hopeful that in the coming months and years, there will be more attention paid towards individuals who don't identify as cisgender women. We also know that reproductive coercion, a lot of times it's talked about as occurring in intimate relationships, romantic or sexual relationships, marriages, dating relationships, but we also know that it can happen in familial relationships. It's not just intimate partners who can perpetrate or experience reproductive coercion. And we also want to make clear that reproductive coercion does not only happen in heterosexual relationships, and just being mindful that transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals and men all do and can experience reproductive coercion. So today, when we're talking about reproductive coercion, we're talking about anyone of any gender identity, unless the information on the screen says otherwise. We also want to note that there are racial disparities among the prevalence of reproductive coercion among certain populations. So we know that female youth and women involved in the foster care system, especially LGBTQ plus youth and women of color, experience disproportionately high rates of reproductive coercion. As well as Black and Latina adolescents, they're more likely than white female adolescents to experience reproductive coercion. We also know that a lot of communities of color have very negative experiences with family planning services. And that's for a multitude of reasons, provider racism, mistrust because of histories of forced sterilization of communities of color. So we would be remiss if we didn't mention and center the fact that there are many racial disparities when it comes to reproductive coercion, just like with any other form of domestic violence or abuse. And again, just reiterating that most of the current research on reproductive coercion and who experiences it is directed towards cisgender women. So the fact that we don't have a lot of statistical information on different communities is because there isn't a lot of research on those communities at this point in time. And in terms of who can perpetrate reproductive coercion, a lot of the current research, again, focuses on cisgender men. They are, at least according to existing research, the most commonly documented individuals who use reproductive coercion. But we know that individuals of all gender identities, and again, in any kind of relationship, can also perpetrate reproductive coercion. As I mentioned, a lot of current research and focus really emphasizes reproductive coercion in sexual or romantic relationships, but there are cases in which family members, for example, moms, have been found to use reproductive coercion against daughters, against children, against other family members as well. So as we move throughout the presentation today, we just kind of wanted to set up the framing this way so that we all know that this is a very diverse issue. This is an example of reproductive coercion. This is a quote from an individual who experienced it. And her quote really demonstrates what is true for a lot of people who experience reproductive coercion, that sometimes there are multiple forms of coercion operating together. And Brenison had mentioned earlier that there's many, many different forms of domestic violence. So just like with domestic violence, a lot of times in an abusive relationship, there might be multiple forms of reproductive coercion. So this particular person shared about their male partner. He used condoms when we first started, and then he would fight with me over it, and he would just stop using condoms completely and didn't care. He got me pregnant on purpose, and then he wanted me to get an abortion. So it transitioned from he refused to wear condoms, which is something that she wanted. She eventually got pregnant, and then he wanted her to get an abortion. So there was birth control sabotage happening. There was pregnancy outcome control also happening. And we'll go more into depth about what these different terms and forms of abuse look like. But again, just offering this as an example, that multiple forms can operate at once, and it really does have a very detrimental impact on individuals' reproductive, sexual health, and emotional health.
So, a little bit more on a definition that we'll offer to you all for what reproductive coercion is. And a lot of you mentioned most of these things in the word cloud that we all created together. But um, just like any form of domestic violence, it's a particular behavior that's aimed to maintain power control over someone for a certain reason. And so, for reproductive coercion, it is to have that control over someone else's reproductive health and reproductive choices. And so those specific behaviors can include some of these things that were mentioned in the word cloud as well too. So again, controlling outcomes of a pregnancy. So it could be abortion, it could be forcing someone to keep a baby against their wishes, coercing a partner to have unprotected sex, or interfering or sabotaging birth control methods, and also sexual coercion as well too, which we'll talk about. And I do want to open up this link really quickly. It is the reproductive coercion, reproductive health wheel. And so if you click on that link, it'll go to this. And I just wanted to show it because I think it does a great job of demonstrating how a lot of these different forms are interconnected. And so on the left here, you'll kind of see everything that's in the, because it's a little difficult to see in that graphic, the information that is provided, but how they, like Maggie was saying, they all kind of work in tandem with each other with other forms of abuse as well too. But we do want to name like reproductive coercion can absolutely happen on its own. And that is 100% valid and just as harmful, but there is a tendency for other forms to be kind of interconnected with that as well. So you'll see how reproductive health can also be impacted by intimate partner violence and vice versa. So just wanted to point that resource out to you as well too, if you think that would be beneficial to look at a later time. And I do see someone has their hand raised. If you're able to kind of write your question in the chat at all, that would be really helpful. We'd love to hear from you. So speaking of writing in the chat, we're curious to know if you think, what you think about the reasons for why someone would be motivated to engage in reproductive coercion. Why would someone choose to use some of the behaviors on the screen? So someone said in the chat, power and control could be a reason. Others are saying line of defense to keep their victimized partner around, keep someone in an abusive relationship for longer, instill fear. It's another extension of general power and control over that partner. Children can also be used for other control tactics, right? So once if they are pressuring someone to become pregnant against their will and then pressuring them to keep a baby, that child could further be used for control and isolation, making them stay against their wishes, feeling isolated, having that power over someone, keeping them vulnerable and dependent, making them feel obligated to stay, stop them from fleeing, use love and motherhood to manipulate. Other people in the chat are saying to satisfy their own wishes for parenthood without consideration for the wishes of their partner. Others are saying because they can. That is definitely a mentality too of like, why not? Or this is just this is what I want to do, and this is what I want, so I'll use these methods to get there. Yeah, thank you for contributing those things in the chat, and we'll talk about it more in this next slide here.
So thank you everyone for sharing. A lot of you mentioned power, and that's at the root of reproductive coercion, is exerting power and control over someone else. Again, it doesn't have to be an intimate partner. It could also be a loved one or a family member. But having that power over someone, having that control over someone, and that's also the root of domestic violence and sexual violence. A couple of you also mentioned um, trying to make someone feel trapped or unable to leave a relationship. And that can be a very common motivation for reproductive coercion. Sometimes individuals will intentionally try to get their partner pregnant because they believe that if their partner gets pregnant, it will be much more difficult for them to exit that relationship. They might be more financially and emotionally dependent on that partner. So that can be a common motivation. In cases in which one partner gets pregnant and maybe they want to carry the pregnancy to term and the other partner doesn't want that, sometimes you see cases of coerced abortion. And that could be because that individual is worried about financial obligations that they would have to the child and to the partner. So a lot of times when you hear about reproductive coercion, it's focused more on getting someone pregnant against their wishes, but we did also want to include forcing or pressuring someone to have an abortion against their will. Another motivation for some individuals is that they might be jealous of the bond that the victimized parent might have with the child. They might feel that if there's a child that enters the relationship, the attention will be diverted away from them and onto the child. And for them, that could be an issue of jealousy and it could be an issue of control. So sometimes that can be a motivation for coercing or pressuring someone into having an abortion. And then in the cases of predatory relationships in which an adult is sexually exploiting a minor, and perhaps the minor becomes pregnant as a result of rape, sometimes a coerced abortion might occur as a way to silence that person. So there are varying motivations for reproductive coercion. We obviously can't speak for everybody who engages in this behavior. These are just a few of the more common motivations that survivors have shared and that have been found in research.
So just kind of bringing some of these components to life. This is a story that we found from a survivor. The name has been changed for protective reasons. And again, we do always provide examples with the caveat that, this isn't the only one way that reproductive coercion exists, the only one way that it looks like or is experienced or the impact that it has. But we thought it would be valuable just to share at least one, knowing that there are so many others as well too. And so I'll just read some of the things on the screen and we can kind of go through it together. And so this person, Anna, said that her marriage was healthy and equal, except when it came to the subject of family planning. Her husband wanted kids as soon as possible, but she wanted to establish her career first. This is Anna speaking, as our relationship progressed, he became more demanding of me, having children. When I reached 30, it intensified. When I achieved a promotion at work, his demands further increased. His behavior really took me by surprise and made me feel like I had no choice. I had to get pregnant. Hannah said she would take the contraceptive pill without telling her husband because she didn't want to become pregnant. Eventually, when she stopped using contraception and gave in to getting pregnant, her husband directed everything, and it was tiring for Anna. And so, just a few things that I thought of as I was reading this, and please feel free to share anything in the chat that came to your mind. But this does kind of outline how people don't really know what reproductive coercion is, right? And saying, oh, well, my marriage is healthy and equal, and then kind of having a realization, okay, well, there is this one thing that doesn't feel totally equal, like I'm being heard. And just things of how it intersects with like economic stability and employment, of maybe things that are, an impact could be in influencing her ability to, perform well at work, or, just the stress that comes with someone kind of trying to force something onto you, and then this idea of like being really taken by surprise by this pressure can um, definitely be a process and realizing for even the victim survivor, like what is even going on. And so coming to a point where someone that you're in a relationship loves you, you're in a marriage, and then making you feel like you have no other choice but to kind of do what they're saying can be really hard. And so that those are some things a part of this story. Um, and then adding on to that, so Anna continues to say he wanted to have sex every day, sometimes several times a day. I felt like I was on this merry-go-round and that the best thing for me to do was to just be compliant. Her pregnancy was overshadowed by the rage and aggression of her husband, she said. When she miscarried, Anna said her husband was great at first, but then became single-mindedly focused on trying for another baby. My body and my mind were just not ready for another pregnancy, she said. I felt like I lost all safety in my body. Anna said she felt worthless and that her only purpose in her marriage was to procreate. The couple are separated right now, and Anna said her husband maintains that to fix their relationship, she needs to give him children. And so there are definitely some things here in terms of like the mentality of this person, the husband, and how the approach is not collective, it's not joint, it's not asking Anna what she wants or how they can work on things together. It's has definitely had this impact on Anna of feeling of losing safety in her own body and not being able to tend to the potentially emotional and physical trauma of having a miscarriage. And then the messaging that she's receiving in terms of feeling worthless and that her only purpose was to procreate. That can all have really, really severe impacts on someone's mental health. And so that's just one story that we wanted to mention. And so we're curious, and we're going to talk more about the impacts later, but what do you perceive to be the impact of reproductive coercion, maybe on this particular victim survivor of Anna? How is reproductive coercion an effective tool to maintain power and control over another person? So you can feel free to add anything that came up for you during this story in the chat. We'll give a moment here. Someone said in the chat that Anna's self-esteem was destroyed. There's so much guilt, right? I remember someone putting sexism in the chat too, of like having this very rigid, you know, gender roles and stereotypes of what to expect, and this person feeling really worthless, helpless, not having control over her own body, not feeling safe in her own body. Right, that maybe fearing that there's no place where she feels that she is empowered. It can be really difficult to heal. Having an inability to heal. There's also an idea in the chat about reversing it where one partner wants a baby and the other doesn't. The partner that doesn't is the offender, and he keeps telling her that he will give into having a baby if she does something for him. But once she does that thing, he says it's not good enough and makes her do more and more. Yeah, that can be absolutely a tool of knowing someone's desire and kind of utilizing that to manipulate them. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that this can show up. Feeling dehumanized, feeling pressured, feeling like she now has no say in her own life or any major life choices anymore, right? Like, what does this mean? Guilt of not having babies and of losing a child, not wanting to be alone or be another statistic that the marriage did not work, right? People kind of wanting to fight for the marriage or thinking of the other positive aspects of the relationship, of like, everything would be perfect if he just wasn't forcing this on me. Societal pressure for cisgender women and heterosexual relationships to want to be a mother. And if women don't want to do that, there can be some guilt or shame, and this can make someone more vulnerable to pressure and coercion. Yeah, even in the story of Anna saying that, she wanted to put her career first and she just got a promotion and things started to escalate more and more at these different arbitrary kind of like timelines of being 30 or being a certain age and having those kind of compounded not only by a partner, but also societal things too. I'll read just a few more. These are really great, and I hope everyone, I do want to put a reminder for you. If you have already sent your message to all panelists, you can like copy and paste it and send it again to all panelists and all attendees, because I think these are really important for everyone to see. But there is a comment about the entitlement on the part of the controlling partner, where there's an implication that because they're generally a good partner or aren't abusing them in any other way, supposedly, that there's leeway for controlling behavior in this one area, right? Um, how this one aspect seems to shrink Anna's entire world to a fixation on procreation and sexual abuse or obligation. Right, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and continue to add that in the chat as well too, as we continue to kind of break down reproductive coercion. So we do want to get into those types that Maggie mentioned earlier. And so we're curious to know which types you have heard of before. And a lot of us have already kind of mentioned this throughout the chat as well too, but we would like to do a poll just to see where most of the attendees are at in terms of what might be more or less familiar to them as we kind of dive into each of these a little more specifically.
I see someone mentioned in the chat that they've heard of multiple of these forms, and they also said the word that comes to mind for them is rape, which ties in really well to what we'll be talking about later, talking about perspectives that people have on reproductive coercion and the kind of language that they use around sexual violence, or what they use to identify their experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that makes sense that there's only one option. So definitely could have made that multiple, but it's interesting to see which ones kind of really jumped out to people. And so birth control sabotage was the most frequently reported from the attendees. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that. And we'll kind of get into each of those types now. So these are the three that we kind of conceptualize them as. And there's a lot of different kind of like some subcategories and examples within each of these that we'll get into.
So I know there's a lot of text on the screen, and that's because there are a lot of different types of birth control sabotage, and we can't possibly cover all of them. There's probably many other types that are not on this slide, but like most of you shared, I think the type of reproductive coercion that more people have heard of is birth control sabotage. I'm not sure why more people have heard of that. It could also be due to the term. Birth control sabotage means what it implies. It's often centered around getting someone pregnant in order to keep them in a relationship. So sabotaging someone's birth control or impeding their use of birth control in some way. So there's many different examples. One example might be hiding someone's birth control, throwing it away, or somehow destroying it. So for example, flushing birth control pills down a toilet, hiding them, replacing the active pills with placebo pills, removing IUDs, poking holes in condoms. I saw that come up a couple times previously in the chat. And again, just a reminder that it's not just an issue that cisgender men might engage in. We do hear from men who mention that sometimes their female partners have poked holes in the condoms, or they've stated that they were on birth control when they actually weren't, because they wanted to get themselves pregnant so that their partner would stay with them. Other examples might be if two partners agree that the withdrawal method is what they're going to use for contraception, and they agree on that beforehand, and then the one partner refuses to withdraw, that's also birth control sabotage. Or not allowing someone to obtain birth control, maybe intentionally withholding financial resources or transportation or things like that that they need to obtain birth control. threatening to hurt someone physically if they use contraception. And then I think one behavior that a lot of people have heard of is manipulating condoms. So I mentioned poking holes in condoms, but a behavior that a lot of people have shared has been they are engaging in sexual activity with someone, they're using a condom, and the partner removes the condom during the middle of sexual activity without permission and sometimes without the knowledge of that individual. And someone in the chat had mentioned that the word rape or sexual violence comes to mind, and we'll talk more about that later. Some survivors who've experienced that type of condom manipulation have shared that for them it felt like sexual violence because they had consented to sexual activity believing it would be protected, and it ended up not being protected. And I'm seeing in the chat someone is saying it's also known as stealthing. So some people use the term stealthing. We tend to use the term non-consensual condom removal. They both refer to the same behavior. Again, birth control sabotage often is centered around getting someone pregnant, not always. Sometimes partners might remove a condom, for example, or sabotage a condom to try to transmit a sexually transmitted infection to someone, but more often it's centered around getting someone pregnant. I'll just check the chat here. Okay, so, right, a couple people mentioned stealthing. Right, and then someone mentioned situations in which maybe a cisgender woman is trying to get herself pregnant against her partner's wishes, so the partner will stay with her. We can move to the next slide. So pregnancy pressure, I think that was the second type of reproductive coercion that more of you had heard of. And pregnancy pressure really is revolving around pressuring someone to get pregnant against their wishes. And so it's not so much focused on birth control sabotage, it's more focused on emotional manipulation, coercion, threats, behaviors like that. So pressuring someone to get pregnant when they don't want to, threatening to leave a partner if they don't become pregnant, threatening a partner that you'll hurt them in some way, emotionally or physically, if they don't carry a pregnancy to term, accusing someone of cheating if they don't want to become pregnant. And then even just kind of using pregnancy as like a loyalty test, which ties back into that sense of entitlement that a lot of you mentioned. Kind of this idea of if you're in a relationship with me or if you're married to me, then you have to prove your loyalty or your respect for me by having a child with me. So demands like that, as well as forcing someone to become a surrogate, which you might sometimes see in cases of sexual exploitation. So this pregnancy pressure is more focused around the emotional aspect of manipulation. And then there are a couple of resources on the upper left of the slide, sorry, Brenison, that Brenison had put at the top. So Safe Harbor, we're in Minnesota, so Safe Harbor involves resources for sexually exploited youth in Minnesota. Breaking Free, they're an agency within St. Paul, Minnesota for individuals who've experienced sexual exploitation. And then there's also some resources for safe abortions. And again, the slides will be sent out afterwards. So if you want to take a look at those resources afterwards, you definitely can. And then we get to pregnancy outcome control. So that was the third type of behavior that was mentioned on the poll, and it's the one that fewer people said that they had heard of. And just like the name implies, pregnancy outcome control is centered around controlling the outcome of someone's pregnancy. So once someone is already pregnant, what's the outcome of that? So for example, forcing someone to have an abortion against their will, we touched on that with coerced abortions, possibly because the partner using reproductive coercion might be jealous or they're worried about financial obligations. Convincing someone that they have no other option but to continue a pregnancy or have an abortion. Hurting someone or threatening to hurt them if they continue a pregnancy or they have an abortion. And physically assaulting someone in an attempt to induce a miscarriage. I think that's a behavior that a lot of us are aware of, but there's not so much attention drawn towards that. And that really ties into that connection between domestic violence and pregnancy. There is a link there. Sometimes survivors will share that it wasn't until they became pregnant that their partner's abuse really started, or maybe it escalated and it became more overt. In the chat, I'm seeing someone say that they had a client, the client's abuser got them pregnant and would bring a lot of animals home to keep her busy to take care of so that she had no time to herself. So that was another way of controlling her. And someone else said, this happens a lot in teen dating relationships. Right. So we had mentioned briefly at the beginning, adolescents who experience reproductive coercion. And there are different resources for adolescents. School-based health centers are really great resources if you're in an abusive dating relationship and you're experiencing reproductive coercion. So that's really good to point out that this isn't just something that happens in adult relationships. We also have a question about, let's see. So I had mentioned physically assaulting someone to try to induce a miscarriage, and someone asked, does that have to be intentional to count as reproductive coercion? So let's say that a couple gets into an altercation and it becomes physical and induces a miscarriage. So that's a good question. Like if a miscarriage occurs, but the abusive partner wasn't intentionally trying to cause a miscarriage, I mean, I think it's up to the survivor what they would want to call that, but I would probably classify it more as domestic violence because there wasn't that motivation to affect the outcome of the pregnancy, if that makes sense. But again, it's up to that individual survivor how they identify that experience. And I think that's it for this slide.
So a little bit about healthy reproductive environment components, and I did see in the chat about the prevalence of reproductive coercion, especially for teens and young adults who may be either like kind of newer to the experience of having sex, or having things of you know it could be a threat to tell parents or to tell others if they don't allow them to have sex in a certain way that does compromise their reproductive autonomy. We think it's important to be able to talk about what are the healthy components of a reproductive environment. And there's not the best language of this, so we acknowledge sometimes it can sound a little awkward, but in terms of being able to engage with someone who does kind of have a way of influencing your reproductive health, what are some red flags and what are some green flags? And so in terms of things kind of like warning signs, there might be red flags of having those rigid expectations regarding birth control and pregnancy. So those are mentioned a lot in the chat too, of things that might be rooted in misogyny, or things in really rigid gender roles of I expect you to want to have a child by this certain age, or even we've worked with public health nurses and others in the healthcare field who have said that partners will go with them to their appointments and either not allow them to speak for themselves, or to kind of say, oh no, this person wants this kind of contraceptive, and not allow them to have access to their own. And so there's a lot of different things of how it can show up with that too. It can be, little, seemingly little comments about, oh, I want to put a baby in you, or oh, I want to and not accounting or asking if that's what that person wants, and kind of discounting their own desires and their own needs, and prioritizing that person's over their partners. Maybe someone, if you are thinking you might be experiencing an unhealthy reproductive environment, you might not feel comfortable bringing up boundaries, right? So it might not be something that was explicitly said, but you have this feeling that you wouldn't be allowed to assert your boundaries. Like, though, that's a completely valid red flag as well too, where you don't feel comfortable saying, hey, actually I decided I don't want to have sex today, or hey, actually I'm not feeling that well, or I forgot to take my birth control pill today, or whatever the case is. Or maybe forgetting a condom and saying, oh, well, that was like our what we agreed upon for contraception, and then feeling like, oh, I'm not allowed to say that we can't have sex because we don't have this, and not feeling like you're able to have access to your own voice about things that happen to your own body. And then another red flag again, so those expressing that, those norms of what they expect from you, or maybe they kind of conceptualize it or frame it as, people who I'm in a relationship with, this is what I expect of them, or my former partners would allow me to do this. What's wrong with you that you're not allowing me to do this? And so there's a lot of different ways that can feel unsafe. Um, but then on the other hand, there are some green flags, right? So having some inquiries about comfort and safety of like, do you feel comfortable with this? Or, if you are talking about family planning, are you doing it in a way where it feels equal and that you both are able to have a say without feeling manipulated or coerced or having fear around like expressing how you actually feel? And maybe like, right, asking for consent, checking in with that person, making sure that they're okay with how things are going, respecting, their right to autonomy over their own reproductive health, and also their ability to change their mind. So feeling comfortable to change your mind and say, hey, initially I said I was comfortable with this, but actually I'm not. And I prefer this instead, and feeling comfortable to do that. And then again, just having that feeling equal and having that level of trust, I think, too, and being able to trust that they'll respect that person, your own boundaries, and respect their own boundaries as well, too, can be some green flags. So we're curious of what other green flags might indicate to you, or, just in general, that someone might be in a safe and healthy relationship or environment when it comes to having reproductive autonomy or feeling safe with how someone might be impacting their reproductive health.
I think kind of going along with this too, with the green flags, I think for people who maybe have a history of multiple previous abusive relationships, that's kind of what you get used to sometimes, and it becomes normalized that you're mistreated. And so it can be really overwhelming to experience mistreatment and abuse in a relationship, but I think sometimes it can also be really overwhelming to be treated well. And sometimes people don't know what to do with that. They don't expect to be treated well. And that's something that can be really difficult to come to terms with, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing in the chat having an open discussion on concerns that may come up, like being able to feel like you're able to do that in the moment, I think is a huge green flag too, right? So sometimes people can feel a sense of violation after the fact as well too. So that's completely valid too, being able to bring it up after the fact and also during, because sometimes things can happen so fast and you're like, wait, this is not okay. I don't know what's going on. Others are saying regularly checking in, thanking your partner for communicating a boundary, right? That positive reinforcement. So the way that people respond to setting those boundaries can really influence that person's sense of safety too. So if every time that someone tries to assert a boundary, they're insulted or they're threatened or they like act really cold or refuse to like do things that they would usually do or something, that's right, communicating that they're not okay with that boundary. And sometimes they can do that with their own body language without explicitly saying those things. Having open discussions about what you want, feeling loved and respected too, like tapping into your own, like, how are you feeling internally? Do you feel like this person is respecting you? Do you feel a sense of love, or do you feel immediate distance if you don't do exactly what they say when they want it? Willingness to accept and learn when they cross the boundary, treating reproductive health and autonomy as an ongoing topic of discussion. That's a huge green flag. Absolutely. Of that, oh, we had one conversation about it, and therefore you should always feel this way. Right. So, again, like having it be something that's more continual. Someone that makes sure they're clear about their hopes of child planning, having kids in the future at the beginning of a relationship, making sure that they're compatible with the partners before moving forward further, so everyone is on the same page. That can be really helpful too. and being adaptable to if that ever shifts, being open to feedback and dialogue and shifting behaviors and reactions that can cause the other person to feel unsafe. Absolutely, yeah. I think those are things that we don't understand the power of our responses to even. So it's like they might say, oh, well, you did express your boundary, but the way that that person reacted to it made it feel like they aren't able to do that again in the future. So those are all definitely things to be mindful of. Thank you.
And now we just wanted to address a little bit more about how people identify their experiences of reproductive coercion. So we know that with any type of abuse, not everyone who experiences what a lot of people would call abuse would even call it that. There are some individuals who maybe experienced what I might call sexual violence, but they wouldn't view it that way. And the same is true for reproductive coercion. We also know that the term reproductive coercion is relatively new. The behavior itself isn't new, but the term is. It really only came into existence in 2000. And so sometimes when people experience reproductive coercion, they struggle to name it. They don't know what to call it. And language can be really powerful. It can be really powerful to know this is what I'm calling my experience. It has a name. But on the other hand, it can also be overwhelming. Similarly to how some people, they're not ready to call their experience domestic violence or sexual violence. That's just not something that they can do, and that's fine. Someone had also mentioned earlier rape. And so we know that some people who experience reproductive coercion, I think, especially with birth control sabotage, feel like I was sexually assaulted or I was raped. Especially with condom manipulation. If you consent to sexual intercourse and you believe that it's going to be protected, and that's what your partner says, that it's going to be protected throughout, and then they end up removing the condom, for example, you didn't consent to that. That's a violation of your consent. So a lot of individuals who are impacted by reproductive coercion, they might not know what to call it. They might really struggle with that. There's also some interesting research out of Australia where Australian men and women who experienced non-consensual condom removal, they were actually less likely to call it sexual assault than people who had never experienced it. And I'm not sure why. That could be because of guilt and shame. It could be they're not ready to call their experiences that. We're not sure. But it's very complicated. And ultimately, it always goes back to what does the impacted person want to call it? How do they want to identify their experiences? There's also some interesting research that an attorney who works in public health did. She interviewed individuals who had experienced non-consensual condom removal, and a lot of them said that they felt ashamed, violated, angry, and hurt, but they didn't know what to call their experiences. One person said, I felt like my experience was rape adjacent. They didn't feel like it was rape, but they felt like it was something close to rape. And so I think all of this just highlights that with an old behavior, with a new term, it just becomes very complicated. And ultimately, it's that impacted person's decision. In the chat, okay, so someone asked if we could revisit birth control sabotage. Sure, so birth control sabotage is essentially impeding someone's access to or use of birth control. So like hiding or destroying or withholding contraceptives, maybe poking holes in a condom without permission, removing a condom during sexual intercourse without permission, flushing birth control pills down the toilet, threatening someone against using birth control. And oftentimes birth control sabotage is really focused around getting someone pregnant.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat about how do religious beliefs tie into this discussion? And this question about how religion can be used to guilt someone specifically if they're considering ending a pregnancy. And there's been a lot of information in the chat too of how some religious traditions also teach that wives should submit to husbands and that motherhood is women's highest calling, which opens the door to reproductive coercion. So I'll just quickly add on to that too, because I think that's a great response. And we did have a webinar about cultural and religious, like spiritual abuse as well too, and that can definitely be something that happens at the same time, right? Of like utilizing cultural or religious beliefs as a way to justify their manipulation and their coercion. So reproductive coercion can be justified by using those cultural expectations or perceived teachings or things as well too. And so we definitely see that being a way of fueling that or making them feel trapped or isolated from their own community too, if they are experiencing reproductive coercion, and kind of having that being justified or saying, oh, you can't reach out to others because they're going to judge you, or you can't reach out to others because they're going to support um, the behaviors of someone who is coercing you. And that can be really like another trauma in itself, of having that response of others of maybe not believing or whatever the case is. So I think that that's a really important part of the conversation in terms of how are other tactics being incorporated into what is expected of them. And I think social abuse can be a really huge one too, of like, you know, friends are getting pregnant as well too, or just saying, oh, you know, whatever the tactic is to try to manipulate that person and make them feel like they don't have a social support system outside of the abusive person. So I think that that's a huge part of the conversation. So I appreciate you for bringing that up. Whoa, I'm skipping way ahead. Okay.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about how people identify their experiences. And I think it can be really, really difficult for people to think about, how do I share my history, especially with a new partner? If you have a history of experiencing domestic or sexual violence or reproductive coercion in a past relationship, a lot of people struggle with, should I disclose that information to a new partner? How much should I disclose and when? And again, like with a lot of things we've shared today, ultimately that is that person's choice. And if someone does think that they're ready to share that information, thinking about, what are you comfortable sharing? Are you going to share your entire story? Do you feel like there's only certain details that you can share? Um, and also keeping in mind that unfortunately you can't manage someone's responses to your disclosure. Sometimes you might share about past abuse and people will respond well, or they won't respond well. I would hope that that person would respond empathetically and they wouldn't blame you, but we know that's not always the case. So if you do decide to disclose in a relationship to someone, um, just keeping in mind that their response, if it doesn't go the way that you hoped, that's not a reflection of your worth as a person. Sometimes people will blame others for abuse, or sometimes people just don't necessarily feel that they have the capacity to respond empathetically. Maybe they have experiences with abuse themselves and they don't feel like they can um, adequately provide support. Or sometimes people just haven't had a lot of experience with being with partners who have a history of abuse. So just always keeping that in mind. If it doesn't go well, that's not a reflection of you. And then also thinking about, if you are considering disclosing your past experiences, how are you going to frame that? Thinking about language and remembering that you don't have to use a word you aren't ready for. If you just want to describe the behaviors that you experienced instead of calling them rape or sexual assault or domestic violence, that is completely up to you. But no matter what happens, just trying to remember that what was done to you was not your fault. You didn't deserve it and it made you uncomfortable. It did harm you.
Absolutely. I think just adding on to that, of feeling a sense of trust with maybe that new partner, and framing it in a way of, you know, our relationship is really important to me, and these are things that have made me feel really disconnected or violated from a previous partner, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page of I don't want to re-experience those things, and just being open about it in that way too um, can be an option as well too. So talking to a partner about potentially coercive reproductive behavior. So we want to be really careful about how we kind of approach this scenario in terms of um, talking to someone who might be right. So maybe you are noticing some of those red flags that we talked about earlier, and you want to bring it up to your partner. And you might think, oh, maybe they're not really doing it intentionally. Maybe they witnessed this growing up, or that they somehow were socialized or learned to believe that this is okay, and I just want to talk to them about this. And again, prevention is hard in this context because the only person who can really prevent it is the person who's deciding to not use reproductive coercive behaviors, right? And so we do want to emphasize the importance of prioritizing your own safety. Again, always doing that safety assessment check and seeing if you feel comfortable bringing up those concerns. Are you afraid? So people can definitely be nervous and say, oh, I don't know how they're going to respond. I don't really want them to be upset. But if it's where they would fear for their safety and for their well-being, if they bring it up, then that would raise issue to a larger concern. But just knowing that you can also reach out to a trusted support system outside of that relationship. So maybe an advocate, like Mary Beth, a therapist or a friend or some family member, maybe for guidance. If you know that they're able to support you, you can even role play what that might be like and kind of how you would approach the situation. And again, some cases it genuinely might not be safe to even bring it up. And so that's when we would maybe advise you to reach out to an advocate for safety planning and kind of having extra support and knowing what your options are so you can make the best choice for you moving forward. But if you do believe it is a healthy relationship, but there are just some things that aren't making you feel comfortable, and you think that they will respect you once that you verbalize what your boundaries are, a way that that could sound is saying, when this happens, it makes me feel this way. This new behavior would make me feel safe when we're being intimate, something like that, to just bring up the conversation and kind of, instead of saying you're doing this and you're, kind of approaching it in that way, using these like I statements of like, I feel this way. This is what has happened in the past. I prefer this. Can we talk about it? How do you feel about this new behavior that I'm suggesting? So that is one way to kind of approach that situation. And I'm just taking a glance at the chat. Um, yeah, so those are, and if anyone has any other questions or ideas for how to kind of approach this topic, feel free to send it in the chat. But we did want to include some of this information for those who might benefit from it. So we'll continue on here. Um, Oh, okay. So we have a prompt here to write in the chat. What are some concerns that you might have? And this could be you talking, or of someone that you're supporting, talking to a partner about potentially coercive reproductive behaviors. And so some of that was mentioned on the slide, right? Like some concerns might be that there's a safety issue. Other concerns could be that maybe they've never talked about boundaries before, and it can be a little like foreign to them. It can be a little like unfamiliar. It can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes when people are engaging in boundaries for the first time, they might feel like their relationship is strained, or they might feel distant, or they might feel not as close initially. But then over time, once it's kind of more respected and they have that mutual understanding, they can kind of reignite that closeness. It can feel a little uncomfortable at first, so that might be a hesitation. I'm looking at the chat. There are a few longer messages, so I just want to see what we can talk about. But some in response to this, some people are saying safety issues, maybe sexually transmitted diseases. So maybe with STIs, people might be concerned about being able to bring it up. High school students will say that's awkward or uncomfortable, right? Or like it's not cool to like bring it up, or there's something wrong with you, or there might be other barriers to that too. Maybe, right? So the response, so maybe they'll give the silent treatment, and that person might regret ever bringing it up, because at least before they brought it up, they were talking to them and communicating to them as well too. So like that stonewalling can be a barrier. sometimes it's not always aggressive, sometimes it's manipulative, right? So sometimes there can be gaslighting in response to bringing this up. So a partner could say, "Oh no, you're like exaggerating, or it wasn't that bad, or you're making that up." So that could be something to make, or fear of losing the partner, right? Or fear of making them mad. If I bring this up, they're going to leave me, or if I bring this up, that they'll be really upset. Um, so those are all things that can definitely be a barrier. So thank you for mentioning that. Um, there is a question in the chat with some context of saying that this person has a lot of clients in domestic violence situations that often describe experiencing sexual coercion, but they don't even know it had gone on or that it's considered a form of abuse. How do you suggest addressing this with survivors that might not understand what they had experienced? Maggie, do you have any thoughts about this? Just want to give you an opportunity if you do.
I kind of I like the system that you had set up on the side about red flags and green flags, and maybe kind of trying that approach, asking that person what makes them feel unsafe sexually and what makes them feel safe. And of course, again, I know I've mentioned this a lot, but if they're not using terms that they're not ready for, like talking about how did you feel when this happened, or what behaviors did you experience, versus telling them, you know, this was sexual coercion or this was sexual abuse. I think kind of framing it that way and helping them think about what makes them comfortable and safe in a relationship sexually versus not can be really helpful. That would kind of be my perspective. I don't know if you had other ideas, Brennison.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking, the approach that I would personally take in terms of talking about, well, these are some things that people who are in like healthy reproductive environments describe. And sometimes when you share that with people, they'll say, "Oh, wow, I've never experienced that before." Or like, "I don't know what it would feel like," or "No one's ever asked me, if I feel safe or if I feel comfortable." And so those can start to bring up some things to them too. And of course, the goal isn't like, I need them to identify what their experience is as reproductive coercion or sexual coercion are different things, but it's kind of like, right, showing them that there's this alternative, right, and that they can be treated in a different way that can be a little bit more of kind of allowing them, kind of like a motivational interviewing, right, of like allowing them to kind of come to their own conclusion of what they would like in their relationship. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Just taking a look at the chat as well too. Um, Sometimes there's a lot of pressure to have sex without protection, even when people request STI testing and a negative panel before things like that happen or don't want to do that. Right. Some people get offended and think that you think I'm dirty or unhealthy. Right. Yeah, there definitely are a lot of different negative reactions that people can have too. So being able to assess also what support exists for you too, if that does happen. Um, Let us know if you have any further questions about that. And I think kind of related to this in the Q&A, there's a question of how can you help someone out from this kind of relationship? And I think it's similar to the response we just gave of, we don't want to be another person who's trying to control them and tell them what they need to do, but kind of helping them again with those like trauma informed approaches of thinking about like safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment, right? So being able to kind of really tailor it to that person and allow them to take the wheels, the rein, the steering wheel. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but allow them to have autonomy, right? And saying like you can so badly want someone to be out of your relationship, but it's not really up to you, right? So how can you be a person of support? How can you be someone that can maybe even help them with psychoeducation about what is a healthy relationship and what are those components, and what are the different resources out there to support them? And so I know that's not always the answer people love to hear. They're like, "Oh, why isn't there a magic bullet of like how to get all these people to not be harmed?" Right? We would love for that to exist, but it is something to definitely approach with care. So we hope that that kind of addresses a little bit, and that you'll have some tools and resources, information from this webinar to maybe bring up with someone who you're concerned about. Okay. So for the sake of time, okay, I'll look at this last chat here. I think it can work asking them if this is right, ask them what they would tell a friend or sister if they told you they were in the same example of a situation, right? So yeah, maybe framing it in that way too, of saying, maybe describing a friend and say, oh, what advice would you give to that person? Or kind of having them think of it, of taking themselves out of that context, and supporting someone else too. That can be another approach. Thanks for adding that. So in terms of, yeah, what are safety? So with all of this, I've been adding this slide to like almost all my presentations, just because I think it's a really great resource and a place to start in terms of going beyond what our typical safety planning measures are, which is oftentimes very restricted to physical safety, and trying to tap into all the different levels of safety too. So like emotional, intellectual, there's so many different forms, and that these different routes of safety can be resources for someone to learn more about themselves. And it's often conceptualized as, like the new love languages of like, these are all things that can make someone or help someone feel safe, but there are some that people really connect with or people really utilize or are drawn to. So this is just a chart to kind of think about routes to safety for, or routes of safety for people who might be experiencing reproductive coercion or any other form of domestic violence as well too, and how can they kind of tap into these different routes. And I know a lot of you are advocates, so kind of how can you support them in accessing these different routes of safety as well too. So these are some examples to consider as well too, and encouraging them to think of specific things that they connect with and that help them. So moving on to some impacts.
So we just had a question quickly about where the roots of safety comes from.
So the roots of safety, it was created by someone with a master's in social work. Pretty sure um, their name is Jake, and I linked it on the slide too. And so I can pull that up here and send it in the chat. But that was just an idea that was conceptualized. So here's some more information on that. Routes of safety. So thank you for drawing attention to that. Okay, so hopefully that answers the question, and we can advance.
All right, thanks, Brenison. So now we just wanted to hear what all of your thoughts are on what are some impacts of reproductive coercion. And we've talked a lot about the ones on the slide already: shame and embarrassment, anxiety and depression, substance use, unintended pregnancy or rapid repeat pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, miscarriages, repeated abortions. So there's a lot of different impacts. We also had someone in the word cloud at the beginning who said loneliness, which I thought was interesting. So if you're comfortable sharing in the chat, we'd like to hear some of your ideas about what are some other ways that reproductive coercion can impact people. Low self-esteem. Rapid repeat pregnancy brings with it a host of health problems, leaves the victim physically and emotionally exhausted. Economic impact, weight loss, weight gain, eating disorders, submissiveness, puts them at risk for additional abuse. Right, and pregnancy isn't always safe for some people. It's not always safe for people to become pregnant or carry a pregnancy to term. So just that physical safety aspect. Vulnerability, isolation, right, mental health. We also had a question a little bit earlier up about information on working with LGBTQ plus people and reproductive coercion and rights. So I don't know of, there are some great organizations in Minnesota that provide reproductive health and sexual health services to LGBTQ plus individuals. So we can link those in the chat or send them out at the end of the presentation. We also have a really great agency in Minnesota. And again, I'm sorry, I know a lot of you are not from Minnesota. That is called Outfront, and they work specifically with LGBTQ plus survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So if you are in Minnesota, that's a fantastic resource, and we can also share that in the chat. Let's see. Right, so reproductive coercion can disrupt other areas of life. So we had mentioned economic stability, or what you want out of a career, your timeline for the rest of your life. And I'm seeing Brenison just put a resource in the chat on queering reproductive health, rights, and justice resource. Okay.
Yeah, they have a great reproductive justice toolkit for people who identify with the LGBTQ community. So that is a really great resource. So thank you for asking about that, because that's a huge part of the conversation too.
And thank you everyone for sharing all of the different impacts. We just really wanted to emphasize that reproductive coercion can obviously cause really extreme safety issues physically, but it also has a very negative impact a lot of times on people's mental, emotional, and psychological health.
So we're almost to the end here. So we do have one more word cloud. So we wanted to kind of end on this kind of more empowering note of what reproductive autonomy means, and then kind of ending on that as well too. So here is the link to add words to the reproductive autonomy word cloud. And then you can also use the QR code, of course, as well too. And I did see the request in the chat for the spiritual abuse recording to be shared. So I'm gonna pull that up and pop that in the chat, but we'll give people a moment to add what they think of when they hear the term reproductive autonomy, which we've mentioned a little bit before, but we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into that. So we're curious of what people's thoughts are currently of that, and then we'll kind of start to build and expand on that as well too. Okay, so I'm going to add these two links.
Hi everybody, as you can see, I'm having.
Oops, sorry, that's the video playing that I'm pulling up.
Hi everybody, as you can see, I'm having.
So this is the spiritual abuse webinar recording. So there's going to be two. So I'm including one with the ASL interpreter and one without. And yes, Maggie added Just Us Health, and also Connect Faith are great resources for this as well too. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly pull up the other word cloud and we can take a look at that. All right, reproductive justice, freedom, choice, safety, respect, boundaries, communication, independence, choice, self-love, boundaries, full humanity is seen, freedom of choice, communication, empowered, self-love, equality, healthy relationship, right to one's own body, trust, empathy, comfort, confidence, love. Absolutely. Defending yourself, exploring, empowered, decision making. Yeah, thank you so much. So being mindful of all of your times, you're going to just jump right back into reproductive autonomy. So kind of in conceptualizing this, we did want to talk about reproductive justice. So that was one of the biggest words that I just saw in the word cloud, which is great. And so this is defined by our justice as something that is achieved when all people and communities have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, sexuality, and reproduction. This includes the right to have children, not have children, and parent our children in a safe and healthy environment. So I think that's a really encompassing definition of what reproductive justice means and can look like. And then in terms of kind of what is that autonomy and that agency piece, so agency broadly is defined as this capacity for someone to be able to act in a given environment, the state of acting or exercising power, or to which an end is achieved, or the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. So exactly what everyone was kind of saying in the word cloud of being able to make those choices freely and within a safe and comfortable environment as it pertains to their own reproductive health and autonomy. And sometimes people really conflate reproductive health with women's health, and we want to acknowledge that reproductive health is something that is not just a cisgender women's issue, right? So we just want to remember that reproductive autonomy is something that everyone should have in the context of their relationships, regardless of their gender or their relationship dynamic. So a little bit more about how to kind of reclaim this idea of reproductive autonomy in future relationships. So feeling comfortable and having a meaningful conversation about past experiences, which we've talked about before. Being able to tell a partner that it's important for them to continually communicate about birth control and pregnancy and other things related to reproductive health, which was something that was mentioned in the chat earlier. It's a continual conversation. It's not just a one and done thing. Again, being able to say no and not fearing those consequences and feeling respected instead, being able to discuss reproductive boundaries and feeling that sense of equality and that your voice deserves to be heard and listened to and that you have a right to feel safe in your own body. And yeah, so and a lot of it can be difficult to navigate that after experiencing something like reproductive coercion. It can feel really unsafe. But these are just some ways of being able to work toward reclaiming that sense of safety and self and ability to have a say of what happens to you. And then here are some more reproductive boundaries. So these are just examples of what reproductive boundaries can sound like. And so we have this offering of invitational language of saying, would you feel comfortable if I take off the condom? It's okay if you don't, instead of I can take the condom off, right? I don't want it on anymore, right? So like those two can really points out the importance of the type of language that you use. And maybe even things like before we start, have you been able to consistently take your birth control? We can do other things if you haven't. So a lot of these have like an additional sentence that doesn't make someone feel like, oh, you're not responsible or, oh, there's something wrong with you. Like it's a very loving approach. And that it's possible to say things like, I'm interested in having kids sometime soon, but I want to make sure it's something we both want at that time for reasons independent of our relationship, right? So not like, oh, I want to have kids if you don't, it's immediately over, right? So just kind of not using it as a threat or manipulation. And then lastly, our offering for this is I want you to be able to talk to me when you want to change our method of birth control without worrying about me being less attracted to you or of it negatively impacting our relationship. We can figure out an option that makes us both feel comfortable and empowered. So those are all really great options for how to kind of communicate those boundaries. Breath. So here's some resources.
And Brennison, somewhere in the chat has a question about having the recording sent to them. And then there's a question about if CEUs are available.
Yeah, so we will be, I'm going to send in a moment how to request a certificate of attendance. So we do offer certificates of attendance that will also be in the follow-up email. So if you need to head out, you'll have all that information in your email in a few hours, I promise. And the recording will be sent out to you as well and available on our YouTube channel. So if you are here, you will get an email because you had to register to be here. So I can send those out. So you can go ahead and continue with the resources, Maggie, and I'll sift through these messages.
Perfect. And so just briefly, we have a couple resources out of the many resources for reproductive coercion support. So if you are a domestic or sexual violence advocate, there's actually a reproductive coercion toolkit created specifically for you that really outlines resources, what it looks like, how to support someone. The list of crisis pregnancy centers, that's on there to avoid it because a lot of people don't know what those are. Crisis pregnancy centers are known to pressure people into having abortions. So we want to make sure that people know and are aware of those because those are not going to be supportive resources for someone experiencing abuse. There's also a contraceptive choices chart that actually looks more in depth at what are the different contraceptive options and are there pros and cons to each in terms of are they discreet and safe for someone who's experiencing reproductive coercion. Nearest Planned Parenthood, Faith Aloud is a faith-based counseling service for people who have questions about pregnancy or abortion. And then there's also All Options, which is a secular helpline for the US and Canada. And again, just reiterating, the crisis pregnancy centers list is on there so that people are aware that those are not supportive resources.
Yeah. And these are some more resources, and some of them were also mentioned in the chat. So we have Black Women's Health Imperative, National Black Doulas Association, Sister Song, Women of Color, Reproductive Justice Collection, Upstream USA, Ancient Song Doula Services, IPAS. So all of these will be sent to you as well too. And so we recognize we're over time, and so we do have a live chat, so feel free to, if you have any questions that come up or any people that you're working with that would like some support or to talk to an advocate, you can do so on our website, wadvocates.org. We also have a lot of resources on our webpage as well too that you can print out or that you can share as a PDF and an email to anyone, so that, again, this will all be accessible to you. And then lastly, please follow us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's where our recording of all of our webinars will be uploaded. We post information 5 days a week, hopefully, on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And then we also have, our emails on here as well too. And I'll CC Maggie on the follow-up email, so you'll have Maggie's contact as well too. When you close out of the webinar, you will get a pop-up of a post-webinar survey. We'd love to hear from you and see what other topics you're really interested in, what worked, what didn't work. You have all been a huge part of kind of curating these different webinar opportunities and how we approach certain topics. So please feel free to take a few moments just to fill that survey out. I also included information in the chat of how to request a certificate of attendance. And if you're someone who's watching the recording, you can email outreach@wadvocates.org to receive a certificate if you did watch the whole thing online as well too. So we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us for these last 90 minutes. Huge thank you to Maggie, and huge thank you to both of our ASL interpreters and Mary Beth for helping to provide support during this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.